Next comment. Though not stated in the verse, the rabbis always understood it in combination with Exodus 22:16, which is explicitly a case of seduction, that the father, and implicitly the daughter, since Israelite women couldn't be forced to marry against their will, had the right to forbid the marriage, but still the family was entitled to compensation of the bride price for virgins. This is also an interesting point, but not in the way you mean it. Because the rabbis understood it in combination with another scripture, which isn't explicitly stated, doesn't mean it was intended to be understood in that way. Experts on something may change the meaning of it. They may take the liberty of changing the meaning of it, of understanding in a different way, if they don't like what it says. And rabbis, just as Christians have found some of these requirements to be unconscionable. And one can easily understand why rabbis would find this to be so. If someone commits an act that could be construed as work on the Sabbath, they're not trying to hurt anyone. Maybe they just weren't paying close enough attention. Maybe they thought they could get by with it. Whatever the case, it's a harsh punishment, as some of the other punishments in the Mosaic Law. For instance, if a rabbi today found that someone had worn a garment made of mixed fabric, and they're required by the law to kill them, that's going to be an unconscionable situation to a decent rabbi. So it makes sense that they would find ways around it, that they would find other ways of understanding it, in spite of the fact that it actually seems pretty obvious in what it says, that it is intending to be a law. You can look at the U.S. Constitution as sort of an analogous situation. In the 1970s, some of the judges on the Supreme Court favored abortion. They didn't like the fact that they couldn't overturn, through the Constitution, they couldn't overturn laws making abortion illegal. So they found provisions within the Constitution. They are constitutional experts who changed the meaning of the Constitution from what it initially was meant to do. They added something to it to make it fit more closely with their ideals. So it's reasonable that rabbis, that pastors, that people in the Vatican, or any religious authority reading the Bible would find ways to negate things they find unconscionable. But that brings about other questions. For instance, if you really believe this law was handed down by God, why would you try to find ways to understand it differently, to relieve yourself of the obligations prescribed in it? It's a difficult question to answer. If marriage was acceptable to the woman and her father, the man had to marry her, provide for her his whole life, while de facto control of the family is put in her hands. She did not have to submit to him after they were married. Even if she disobeyed him, refused to take care of the house, nagged and berated him in public, or even refused to live with him, he had no right of divorce. Thus, he had to win her affection and submission or suffer her lordship. This might be applicable in cases in which rape was not forcible. However, if the rape was forcible and was covered by this rule in the Mosaic Law, which it would seem to be that I have been discussing, and her father, or she, refused to carry through with the marriage, then essentially his only punishment is to pay a bride price. It doesn't really seem like a big thing, does it? Your next comment: what we normally think of as rape, sociopath lurking in the shadows waiting to jump, savage, and degrade a young female, was punished under the laws for assault, battery, kidnapping, and attempted first-degree murder. The last two are capital crimes. If adjudged to be the case of assault and battery, the aggravated circumstances and atrocities typical of serial rapists allowed the victim and her family to appeal the priests, who by all accounts sentenced the rapist to death. Nowhere in my example did I say he did any physical injury to her, other than that directly associated with rape, which actually wouldn't necessarily be physically significantly more damaging than a consensual sexual act. especially for a young virgin. As far as the laws for assault and battery are concerned, let's see, I'm pretty sure what the law said about assault and battery was that the perpetrator was to suffer the same losses as the victim. For instance, if he attacked the girl and in the process put out her eye, then his eye was to be put out. If he knocked out a tooth, his tooth was to be knocked out. If he broke her arm, his arm was to be broken. But if he hasn't done any significant physical damage to her, other than that directly associated with the rape, well, what would be his punishment then? In the last, you said, as for the Sabbath, I'd hope my examples would have been understood as illustrative and not exhaustive. Gathering firewood is like gathering wood, a routine activity of basic sustenance, a regular chore that was part of making a living. Pulling your mule out of a ditch it fell into on the Sabbath didn't constitute work. Neither did cleaning up your infant's vomit or spilled milk or changing its diapers. Okay. This goes back to the same consideration I mentioned earlier of rabbis finding ways around stuff. Obviously, things like eating or changing a diaper, because they're absolutely necessary, because if you stopped doing them every Sabbath, it would cause problems. You can't go a day without feeding your baby. They made exceptions for those things. The scripture itself says, however, anyone doing any work. As you said, it doesn't specify work. In the example I gave in my first response to you, in which the man in Exodus was supposedly executed for picking up sticks, it doesn't say he was chopping firewood or even he went out to gather firewood. For all the details it gives, he could have just seen some sticks lying by the side of the road and picked them up and was seen doing it. And if I remember correctly, it even states that those who initially arrested him didn't know what to do with him. That would imply they didn't know if what he had done was considered work or not. But according to the account, God had him put to death as an example. There's nothing about the scripture that implies it wasn't to be applied to such things as a woman cleaning her house, which sweeping the floor would be. That's not the same, as I said in a comment to another viewer, that would not be the same as just picking up the food in order to salvage it from the floor. In this case, it was cleaning up a mess. It was housework, which is, it seems, any kind of work. Whether rabbis chose to follow their conscience and refused to execute people for doing so or not. Anyway, that's my response. I know it's kind of long. I may even have to go back and re-record it and try to chop some off, but we'll see. Anyway, see you next time.